ओके, गुड इवनिंग फ्रेंड, वेलकम टू अवर चैनल एग्जामपुर आईएएस इंग्लिश मीडियम। आप सभी का हमारे परिवार एग्जामपुर में स्वागत है। सो टुडे इन दिस सेशन वी आर गोइंग टू कंटिन्यू विद द डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट, एंड today in this session we are going to see disaster management in India, how disaster management initiated in India, and apart from that, what is Disaster Management Act 2005, what is disaster management plan, and what were the challenges and how these plans are successful. We are going to discuss all about this. So kindly join the session, subscribe our channel. So thank you, thanks a lot everyone. Welcome Ridul, good evening. सभी बच्चे जुड़ जाएं. Good evening all of you. If you have any doubt regarding tomorrow's class, please do let me know. So in yesterday classes we have discussed regarding what is disaster management, how we are going to define disaster. Apart from that, we have also tried to understand how hazard is different from disaster. Generally what happens, the students generally get confused regarding the hazard and disaster. We have tried to demarcate what is hazard and what is disaster. Apart from that, we have also studied what vulnerability, risk, how vulnerability and risk are associated with each other, and we have also studied regarding different examples also we have also studied. So if any doubt, please do let me know. Mridul, kindly share the session को share कर दीजिए. Kindly share the session. चलिए. So we are going to start regarding disaster management in India. We all know regarding the Disaster Management Act 2005, but the process is not so simple. What is the background? How the Disaster Management Act 2005 came into being? What is the historical perspective? How during the time of British the disaster management dealt on? All we are going to discuss. So if you talk about the pre-independence era, if you talk about pre-independence era, that means during the time of British. Welcome Deepak Kumar. All my notes will be submitted today itself. When I will just convert my PPTs into PDF. Okay, so we are talking about the background regarding how the Disaster Management Act 2005 came into being. So let us have an idea what happens during the time of British era. Means particularly we are talking about the pre-independence era. So there the policies were oriented not toward the mitigation effect. The policies were oriented not toward the mitigation effect. That means pre-disaster planning were absent. Pre-disaster planning or mitigation things were absent. Mitigation strategies were absent. Basically, those policies are more oriented toward the relief. Relief means what? Suppose the disaster has happened. Now they have to provide the relief. Medical exigencies will be provided. Food stuff will be provided. ठीक है ना? And the persons who are injured, they will be hospitalized. So you can say the post-disaster things are being taken care of during the pre-independence era. ठीक है ना? Post disaster things were being carried out during the pre-independence era. That is why it is being written over here कि in the pre-independence era, that means during the time of British, during British, okay, British period, during British period. Okay, so in the pre-independence era, the policy was relief oriented and relief department was set up for emergency during disaster. That means they were more oriented toward the post-disaster things. ठीक है ना? Relief will be provided, medical emergencies will be provided, medical exigencies will be provided, and those who are critically injured, they will get hospitalized. This is not basically disaster management. That means we are just concerned the post-disaster things. So this is not disaster management. Already we have known when we talk about the disaster management, we have to completely deal with the disaster management cycle. We have to think of pre-disaster, how the things will be planned so we can reduce disaster risk. During the time of disaster, what are the things to be taken care of? Rescue operations, certain medical emergency kits should be there with us, and after that we have to think for the post-disaster recovery, reconstruction, all those things. So this cannot be called as disaster management. Just thus they have to manage the disaster, that to post disaster things. Is it clear? Okay. Post independence. Now we are talking about the post independence. Post independence, the task for managing disaster continued to rest with the relief commissioner. So देखिए होता है ना, हम लोग क्या कहते हैं, things जो होता है ना, it do not change abruptly. Things do not change abruptly. कैसे चेंज होता है? ग्रेजुअल चेंजेस होते हैं. तो even after we have achieved independence, the disaster management or managing the post independence, the task for managing disaster continued to rest with the relief commissioner in each state, who function under the central relief commissions with their role limited to delegation of relief materials and money in the affected area. So now you can see that the same thing continued even after the post independence. No doubt there were relief commissioners who were functioning under the central relief commissioners. So relief commissioners, they were basically responsible for post disaster stuff. Post disaster means the disasters happen, now they are responsible for providing medical exigencies, food stuffs. Those who were critically injured, they have to be hospitalized. So this thing we can't call it a disaster. We are not managing the disaster. Do you think, Mridul, Deepak ji, are you managing the disaster? We are not managing the disaster. How the disaster are being managed? First of all, we have to do the capacity building. We have to think of the mitigation strategies so that we can reduce disaster risk. After that, we have to take care of that during the disaster. What are the things to be carried on, and post disasters, reconstruction, recovery things to be carried on. Okay. So now we have to see regarding how the Disaster Management Act 2005 came into being. How the Disaster Management Act 2005 came into being and who are responsible for it. So you can see that a permanent and institutionalized setup began in the decade of 1990s with setting up a disaster management cell under the Ministry of Agriculture, following a declaration of the decade of 1990 as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction by United Nations General Assembly. So you can think that during the year of 1990, United Nations declared that particular decade means from 1990 to 2000 as the International Decade for National Disaster Reduction. Okay, and considering this, disaster management has been started under the Ministry of Agriculture. But following a series of disasters such as Latur earthquake, Malpar landslide, Odisha super cyclone, Bhuj earthquake, a high-powered committee under the chairman of Mr. J.C. Pant, Secretary of Ministry of Agriculture, were constituted. But after the 1990, when you have started a permanent body to look after the disaster under the Ministry of Agriculture, a lot of serious incidents, a lot of serious disasters have happened, like Bhuj earthquake. After that, in the Ministry of Agriculture, the Cabinet Secretary, the Ministry of Agriculture Secretary जो है उसका secretary जो थे Mr. J.C. Pant, ठीक है ना? A high power committee was chaired under J.C. Pant and they were basically responsible for how to develop our disaster management policy. So J.C. Pant जो है, he is responsible for to develop our disaster management policy. Consequently, the disaster management division was shifted from the Ministry of Home Affairs. So you can see that after the committee recommendation by Mr. J.C. Pant, you can say that the disaster management division that were lying with the Ministry of Agriculture, that has shifted from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Home Affairs. ठीक है ना? Ministry of Home Affairs. ठीक है? And a hierarchical structural for disaster management evolved in India. The 10th 5-year plan document also had for the first time a detailed chapter on disaster management. And after the J.C. Pant committee report, even in the 10th 5-year plan, disaster management was being properly included. Okay. Now we will see paradigm shift of disaster management. How the Disaster Management Act 2005 evolved and what were the main provisions that are being mentioned in the Disaster Management Act 2005. So when you talk about the shift, already you have seen that following the recommendation of J.C. Pant, the disaster management cell, or the disaster management division, it was being shifted from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Home Affairs. Okay, so paradigm shift in disaster management on 23rd December 2005. How much? On what date? 23rd December 2005. the government of India enacted Disaster Management Act 2005. Okay, the government of India on 23rd December 2005, it has enacted Disaster Management Act 2005, which created, which envisages the creation of National Disaster Management Authority, National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority, District Disaster Management Authority, and to adopt a holistic and integrated approach of disaster management. So now you can think that following all the recommendation of J.C. Panthenam, Ministry from the shifting of disaster management cell from Ministry of Agriculture to Ministry of Home Affairs, and apart from that, on 23rd December 2005, Disaster Management Act was being created, which clearly indicates that there should be a National Disaster Management Authority, a State Disaster Management Authority, District Disaster Management Authority, and an integrated approach should be followed so that we can minimize the risk of disaster. Okay? Okay, so now we'll go for the Disaster Management Act 2005. Is it clear for everybody? Please do let me know. Clear hai? Mridul, Deepak? Basic fundamental things we should discuss it so that you will have little bit idea regarding how the Disaster Management Act 2005 came into being. बताइए. बताएं. दीपक जी, मृदुल जी, प्लीज बताएं, क्लियर है चीजें? Deepak, are you there in the class? देखिए, today's when we talk about the institutionalization or when we talk about the act, it seems to be a little bit boring, but it is very much important from the perspective of mains, because whenever you are writing some answers regarding the case study, how the landslides, avalanches, flood are being managed, you have to quote these things. What is Disaster Management Act 2005, NDRF, National Disaster Response Force, है ना, National Executive Committee. You have to quote all these things. For quoting all these things, little bit you should have idea regarding how it is being developed and what is it functions and how it functions. Is it clear? Yes sir, chalo, ठीक है. So now we are going to discuss what is Disaster Management Act 2005, what are its functions, what are the objectives, and how it entails the creation of different bodies. ठीक है ना? Okay, so you can see that the National Disaster Management Act 2005 lays down institutional, legal, financial coordination mechanism at the national, state, district, and local level. So you have seen that when you talk about the National Disaster Management Act, it has created a holistic and integrated approach. First of all, it deals with the institutional things. It deals with the institutional thing. It has created a National Institute of Disaster Management, where different forces are being trained regarding how to deal with the disaster management, how to develop the resilience during the disaster management. So it has dealt with the institutional thing. Apart from that, certain legal things are also being managed. Certain legal things are also being mentioned. Okay, financial means how to manage the finances during the time of disaster management. It has created a body for managing the finance. Coordination between a state level, national, like National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority, District Disaster Management Authority, and local, we have Panchayati Raj for managing disasters. So, ठीक है ना? The Act provides for the setting up of National Disaster Management Authority at national level, State Disaster Management Authority at state level, and District Disaster Management Authority at district level. The primary responsibility for management of disaster rests with the state government concerned. ठीक है ना? The state government, the primary responsibility of managing the disaster rests with the state government concerned, and apart from that, the institutional mechanism put in place at the center, state and district, it helps the state to manage the disaster in an effective manner. Don't worry, we are going to cover each and every aspect. So you have seen that when you talk about the National Disaster Management Act, it basically deals with it basically handles disaster in a holistic and integrated way. It talks about the institutional things, just like we know the National Institute of Disaster Management is being created for the purpose of training, for the purpose of enhancing the capacity, and for the purpose of ensuring resilience during the time of disaster. Means how the things are being made resilient, how the structures are being made resilient. Apart from that, we talk about the legal financial thing also, and coordination between a state level, national level, state level, and the district level. Okay. Now, first of all, we have to see institutional framework at national level. Institutional framework, since the National Disaster Management Act, it talks about your institutional things. So we have to see about the institutional framework. Okay, na? Please try to be attentive in the classes. It seems ये classes जो है थोड़ा सा जो act जो होते हैं, it seems to be little bit boring, but it is very much essential for your mains examination. Please do not ignore this session. It's a humble request to each and everyone. Deepak ji, Mridul ji, and kindly share the session as much as you can. It's your responsibility to share it from your side, so that the more crowd joins our session. ठीक है, चल. कुछ भी डाउट हो, please do let me know. So now we are going to see about institutional framework at national level. ठीक है ना, मतलब what are the institutions that are being involved for the purpose of managing the disaster, for the purpose of reducing disaster, for the purpose of reducing disaster risk. So you can see that first of all, Disaster Management Division. You know the Disaster Management Division has been shifted from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Home Affairs after recommendation from the JC Pant. ठीक है ना? So that is what Disaster Management Division, Ministry of Home Affairs, the overall coordination of disaster management based with the Ministry of Home Affairs. So you can see that at the top level, at the top letter, Ministry of Home Affairs is responsible for managing the disaster. Ministry of Home Affairs is responsible for managing the disaster. The Disaster Management Division किसके अंतर्गत आता है? Ministry of Home Affairs के अंतर्गत आता है. The Disaster Management Division is responsible for what? Response, relief, preparedness for natural calamities and man-made disaster except drought and epidemics. So you can see that when you talk about Disaster Management Division, which lies under the Ministry of Home Affairs, basically it is responsible for response, relief, preparedness, mitigation effect or different type of disaster, if it is natural also, if it is man-made also. But yes, they are not concerned toward the drought and epidemics. Okay. On behalf of the central government, Disaster Management Division in the Ministry of Home Affairs coordinates with the disaster affected state government. So you can see that basically जो है Ministry of Home Affairs के अंतर्गत जो है आपका Disaster Management Division आता है. Now this Disaster Management Division is responsible for coordinating with the states which are being affected with the disaster. ठीक है. So that is what it is written over here. On behalf of the central government, the Disaster Management Division and the Ministry of Home Affairs coordinates with disaster affected state governments concerned, Line Ministry Department, National Disaster Management Authority, National Disaster Response Force, National Institute of Disaster Management, and the Directorate General of Fire Services, Home Guards, Civil Defense, Armed Forces for effective disaster risk reduction. So you have seen that the Disaster Management Division that lies under the Ministry of Home Affairs, it is basically responsible for coordinating with the state government which is being affected by the disaster. ठीक है ना? It basically coordinates with the state government concerned. It basically it basically coordinates with the National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority. It coordinates with the National Disaster Response Force. Even it coordinates with the National Institute of Disaster Management. ठीक है ना? National Institute of Disaster Management and the Directorate General of Fire Services for the purpose of firefighting, Home Guards, Civil Defense, Armed Forces for effective disaster risk reduction. ठीक है? चलिए. So now you have to see that what is the process of downloading exam4 application. ठीक है ना? हम लोग जो भी पढ़ाते हैं, whatever we are teaching, you will get the PDF of this of our lectures on the exam4 application. So please let us know what is the process of downloading example application. So in the first step what you have to do, step 1 में जो है you have go, अगर आपके पास जो एंड्रॉइड फोन है, ठीक है, तो आप वहां पे जाके क्या कर सकते हैं, यू कैन डाउनलोड द प्ले स्टोर, आप जो है प्ले स्टोर को डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं। प्ले स्टोर को डाउनलोड करने के बाद जो है वहां पे आपको एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन लिखना है, वहां पे जो है आपको एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन लिखना है। जब एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन लिखेंगे तो वहां पे आपको क्या, कौन सा एप्लीकेशन दिखाई देगा, वहां पे दिखाई देगा आपको एग्जाम्पल सरकारी नौकरी प्रिपरेशन, एग्जाम्पल सरकारी नौकरी प्रिपरेशन, ठीक है ना। उसके बाद जो है उसको आपको इंस्टॉल करना है। इंस्टॉल करने के बाद आपको वहां पे रजिस्ट्रेशन करना है। रजिस्ट्रेशन में आपसे पूछा जाएगा कि आपका नाम क्या है, डेट ऑफ बर्थ क्या है, ईमेल आईडी क्या है, पासवर्ड क्या है, फोन नंबर क्या है, स्टेट क्या है, सिटी क्या है, ठीक है ना। इसको जब आप रजिस्टर कीजिएगा आपका एग्जाम्पल जो है एप्लीकेशन में आप रजिस्टर हो जाएंगे। उसके जो भी आप तैयारी कर रहे हैं एग्जाम्पल की जो सबसे खास बात है कि मैक्सिमम कोर्सेज जो होते हैं फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट प्रोवाइड करते हैं। तो आपको फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट भी, यहाँ तक कि आपको पेड बैचेज भी चाहिए तो इसके थ्रू आप पेड बैचेज भी खरीद सकते हैं। इज इट क्लियर? आप लोगों ने डाउनलोड करके रखा है एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन? दीपक कुमार, मृदुल जी, आप लोगों ने एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन डाउनलोड करके रखा है? प्लीज बताइए एक बार, जल्दी से बताएं। ठीक है, again I'm repeating it once more, those aspirants who want to prepare for UPSC or one day examination, whatever it is they are having, they have to download the example application, because whatever the lectures are being delivered, their PDF जो होता है you will get it on the example application itself, ठीक है ना। So for the purpose of downloading example application, what you have to do, if you are having the Play Store, in the Play Store you can search example application, ठीक है ना। तो एग्जाम्पल एप्लीकेशन आप सर्च कीजिएगा, यू विल गेट एग्जाम्पल सरकारी नौकरी प्रिपरेशन, एग्जाम्पल सरकारी नौकरी प्रिपरेशन, ठीक है। सोनम क्राफ्ट क्रिएशन, वेलकम सोनम, ठीक है। सो एग्जाम्पल सरकारी नौकरी प्रिपरेशन, उसका इंस्टॉल कीजिएगा। इंस्टॉल करने के बाद यू हैव टू रजिस्टर। व्हाट इज द प्रोसेस ऑफ रजिस्टरिंग? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल नेम आपको फिलअप करना है, डेट ऑफ बर्थ फिलअप करना है, ईमेल, पासवर्ड, फोन नंबर, सिलेक्टेड स्टेट्स एंड सिटी, ये आपको सारे आपको फिलअप करना। वंस इट इज फिल्ड आपका रजिस्ट्रेशन हो जाएगा। आफ्टर दैट देयर आर लॉट ऑफ ऑप्शन, यू आर हैविंग द ऑप्शन टू ऑप्ट फॉर योर पेड कोर्सेज। अगर आप पेड कोर्सेज नहीं ज्वाइन करना चाहते हैं तो आप जब क्लासेस कर रहे हैं, बहुत एग्जाम्पल की खास बात यह है कि बहुत सारे कोर्सेज जो होते हैं फ्री ऑफ कॉस्ट प्रोवाइड करते हैं, यहाँ पे आप सारे पीडीएफ को डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं। इज इट क्लियर? ठीक है। सोनम क्राफ्ट क्रिएशन, आर यू प्रिपेयरिंग फॉर यूपीएससी? एक बार जल्दी से मुझे बता दीजिए सोनम जी, Are you preparing for UPSC? चलिए ठीक है। So we are discussing regarding the Disaster Management Act 2005. Now we have to see in the institutional mechanism itself, it talks about the creation of National Executive Committee. Are you getting my point? The Disaster Management Act 2005. It talks about the institutional thing. So we have seen that Disaster Management Division under the Ministry of Home Affairs, taken how it coordinates with the state government concern. Apart from that, how it coordinates with the National Disaster Response Force, National Disaster Management Authority. Apart from that, the different organization that is responsible for managing the disaster. जी गुरु जी, ओके। आप इंग्लिश मीडियम से तैयारी कर रहे हैं? इंग्लिश मीडियम से तैयारी कर रहे हैं कि हिंदी मीडियम से? पहली बार आप मेरी आज क्लास में आए हैं, आई थिंक इट्स योर फर्स्ट क्लास। ठीक है, चलिए। Okay, so now we have to discuss regarding the National Executive Commission. National Executive Commission, what is its function? So you can see that it acts as a coordinating and monitoring body for disaster management. ओके ओके, हमने आपके वीडियोस देखे हैं गुरुजी। ओके, कोई बात नहीं है, ठीक है ना। शायद आप लाइव क्लासेस में, मेरी लाइव क्लास में पहली बार आए हैं, यू आर मोस्ट वेलकम सोनम जी। चलिए, सो वी आर डिस्कसिंग रिगार्डिंग द नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमीशन। तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल इट फंक्शन इज टू it acts as a coordinating and monitoring bodies for disaster management. It is responsible for coordinating with the different associations, different organizations. It is chaired by Union Home Secretary and comprises of secretary level officers from the ministries and department having control of agriculture, atomic energy, defense, drinking water supply, environmental, forest, finance, health, power, rural department, space, telecommunication, urban. So basically, when you talk about the National Executive Committee, in the Executive Committee, in the, ठीक है ना? So when you talk about the National Executive Committee, it is basically responsible for coordinating and monitoring body for disaster management. It is being chaired, जो उसका चेयरमैन जो होगा वो कौन होगा, क्योंकि आपको पता है चेयरमैन कौन होगा, क्योंकि आपको पता है कि चेयर जो डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट जोन जो है वो किसके अंतर्गत आता है, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स के अंतर्गत आता है। तो उसके कारण से जो है आपका नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव बॉडी की बात करेंगे जिसका मेन पर्पस कोऑर्डिनेशन जो है, उसका चेयरमैन कौन होगा, इट्स चेयरमैन जो होगा वो आपका यूनियन होम सेक्रेटरी होगा, मतलब होम मिनिस्ट्री का जो सेक्रेटरी जो होता है वो उसको चेयर करेगा। लेकिन उसके अंदर में जो है डिफरेंट आपके सेक्रेटरी लेवल ऑफिसर्स होंगे फ्रॉम डिफरेंट मिनिस्ट्री। जैसे आप देख सकते हैं यहाँ पे एग्रीकल्चर, एटॉमिक एनर्जी, डिफेंस, ड्रिंकिंग वाटर सप्लाई, एनवायरमेंट, फॉरेस्ट, फाइनेंस, हेल्थ, पावर, रूरल डेवलपमेंट, साइंस एंड टेक्नोलॉजी, स्पेस, टेलीकम्युनिकेशन, अर्बन डेवलपमेंट, वाटर रिसोर्सेज। सो ठीक है ना, from all these department secretaries will be there so that a proper communication will be established, and through that proper communications a proper coordination can establish, ठीक है ना। What are the things to be followed? Suppose when you talk about the particular area, just listen to me, okay? When you talk about the particular area, just like we talk about the Kosi belt, आप सभी को पता है कोसी, the sorrow of Bihar. When you talk about the but sir, no any other class PDF is available on the application example English medium. ठीक है ना, we are दीपक जी अभी जो है अभी when we are just taking the classes, we will provide you the PDF on the Drona group itself. Drona group में जो है we will provide you the PDF, ठीक है ना, or else this PDF I will submit it on the application itself, ठीक है। ठीक, चलो ओके। सो क्या होता है, जस्ट थिंक ऑफ इट, बेसिकली नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमिटी जो इट इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर कोऑर्डिनेटिंग एंड मॉनिटरिंग, ठीक है ना। कोऑर्डिनेशन मींस इट हैज टू कोऑर्डिनेट विद द डिफरेंट डिपार्टमेंट्स, दैट इज व्हाई यू हैव सीन दैट नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमिटी जो है इट इज बीइंग चेयर्ड बाय मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स सेक्रेटरी, एंड आफ्टर दैट जब मेंबर की बात करेंगे तो सेक्रेटरी लेवल ऑफिसर्स फ्रॉम द डिफरेंट डिपार्टमेंट्स आर बीन एनरोल्ड। अब क्या होता है कि सपोज when you talk about the Kosi belt or when you talk about the lower part of the Assam, तो आपको पता है कि these things are always been flooded. So now you have to coordinate with the agricultural department and you have to do the brainstorming कि यहाँ पे कौन से agricultural product को हम agricultural चीज पे follow करें ताकि वहाँ की economy shut down नहीं, है ना। जैसे आपने देखा था कि केरला रीजन में one type of paddy is being found called Nerigli paddy which can tolerate flood for 45 days, ठीक है ना, which can tolerate flood for 45 days. The Ministry of Agriculture को उसको पता है, he can entail the body कि हाँ we are having certain paddy varieties, we are having certain wheat varieties that can tolerate the flood and we can implement it so that at least जो है economic activities, agricultural activities are not completely shut down during the time of flood itself. That is one just example how the things are being coordinated, ठीक है ना, how the things are being coordinated. Even when you talk about the science and technology, जो आपके नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमिटी जो इट कैन कोऑर्डिनेट विद साइंस एंड टेक्नोलॉजी व्हाट वी कैन डू फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ क्लियरली मॉनिटरिंग फ्लड और व्हाटएवर इट इज, है कि नहीं। तो दे कैन से दैट सर वी कैन मॉनिटर इट विद द हेल्प ऑफ हेलीकॉप्टर आल्सो इफ यू आर हैविंग द मनी, बट अगर पैसा नहीं है वी कैन आल्सो मॉनिटर इट विद द हेल्प ऑफ ड्रोन टेक्नोलॉजी और अनमैन्ड एयर व्हीकल टेक्नोलॉजी, ठीक है। तो दिस इज हाउ द प्रॉपर कोऑर्डिनेशन इज बीइंग एस्टैब्लिश्ड बिटवीन द डिफरेंट डिपार्टमेंट्स। The chief of the integrated defense staff or the chief of a staff committee ex officio is also its member. The national executive committee will coordinate response in the event of any threatening disaster situation or disaster where central assistance is needed. That means what? That means the national executive committee जो it is basically responsible for coordination and should try to coordinate with the different departments when it feels that there is a disaster, and that when you talk about the disaster that it is having the potentiality to create a great havoc, ठीक है ना। Then it is going to talk with the different departments कि how to manage the risk, how to mitigate the risk, ठीक है ना। How to mitigate the risk मतलब होता है कि before disaster what we can do for the purpose of building resilience, what we can do for the purpose of building the capacity, what we can do for the purpose of creating infrastructure so that casualty can be minimized, ठीक है ना, and the people can be saved, economic activities will not be properly shut down. The National Executive Committee may give direction to the relevant ministries, departments of Government of India, state government and the state authorities regarding measures to be taken by them in response to any specific threatening disaster situation or disaster as per the needs of the state. Already we have discussed. ठीक है? Any doubt till here? Are you guys comfortable in English? Deepak ji, Medul ji, Sonam ji, are you guys comfortable in English? Are you guys समझ में आ रहा है आप लोग को? इंग्लिश में कोई प्रॉब्लम तो नहीं हो रही है? एक बार जस्ट मुझे कमेंट करके बता दीजिए. ठीक है, चलिए. So now we are going to discuss regarding National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. From the name itself, you can acknowledge that this particular body, it is responsible for capacity building. It is responsible for resilience. It is basically responsible during the time of pre-disaster. है ना? The body itself indicates that it is responsible for capacity building. Responsible for capacity building. Capacity building to increase the resilience, and basically all these things are being done pre-disaster. मतलब they are concerned with the pre-disaster stuff. Pre-disaster. ठीक है, चलिए. So let us study regarding the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. So what is it? The Government of India recognized the need to evolve a participatory process of decision making with active involvement of the central and state government and other stakeholders, including people representing different interests in the field of disaster management. Accordingly, a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral national platform of disaster risk reduction was constituted. So what is the purpose? So already we have seen that the function of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction is to reduce the disaster effect, or is to reduce the disaster risk. And how it can be done? It can be done when you think about pre-disaster things, है ना? Suppose pre-disaster आपको पता चल जाता है कि this particular area is going to get inundated with flood, it is going to get flooded. Now what are the steps you must take it so that you can prevent it? तभी ना होगा. This is the particular way of reducing the risk of disaster. So that means you have to think of pre-disaster thing, and for this purpose it thinks of participatory process. Participatory process means that involvement of central government, state government, other stakeholders, even the people, even the communities people, ठीक है ना? Even NGOs, they can be also involved for the purpose of disaster risk reduction, ठीक है ना? That is why it is being represented at multi-stakeholders and multi-sectoral national plan for disaster risk reduction. The National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction is chaired by Union Home Minister, Ministry of State in charge of disaster management in the Ministry of Home Affairs, and Vice Chairman National Disaster Management Authority is the Vice Chairperson of ND. ये थोड़ा सा जो है, you do not have to remember it, just for the sake of recalling the thing. National Platform of Disaster Risk Reduction, you might be knowing that it falls under the Ministry of Home Affairs. So definitely क्या होगा? Union Home Minister, first thing, a Minister of State in charge of disaster management in the Ministry of Home Affairs, they are responsible. And apart from that, Vice Chairman of National Disaster Management Authority जो होगा, इसका क्या होगा? Vice Chairman होगा. A Special Secretary, Additional Secretary in charge of Disaster Management Division in the Ministry of Home Affairs will be convener to the NPTR. So just, you do not have to just remember things, but you just remember the things. You do not have to remember who is the chairman of what body, who is the vice chairman of what body. Yes, definitely you have to remember what is this body, what is the function of this body, and how it coordinates with the different departments for the purpose of disaster risk reduction. This is of much importance, so that whenever you are writing the answer, you can quote this body, and when you are going to quote this body, when you are well acquainted regarding its function, जब आपको पूरी तरीके से इस body का functions को बारे में पता है, then only you can quote this body कि yes, I can quote National Executive Committee. When the things are been required, we have to think of coordinating with the different departments. Now we have to see the function of national platform of disaster risk reduction. ठीक है ना, national platform for disaster risk reduction, function of national platform of disaster risk reduction ठीक है ना, national platform of disaster risk reduction. Now we have to see the function, and you must know the function is important, then only you are able to quote it into example. Now what is the function? The function is to review the progress made in the field of disaster management from time to time, to appraise the extent and manner in which the disaster management policies has been implemented by the central and state government and other concerned agencies, and to give appropriate advice in this matter, to advise regarding coordination between the central and state government, union territory administration, local government, and the civil society for the development of disaster risk reduction, to advise suo motu or on a reference made by the central government or any state government or union territory administration on any questions pertaining to disaster management, to review the disaster management policy. So you can see that when you talk about the national platform for disaster risk reduction, and basically basic purpose is to see the progress in the field of disaster management. ठीक है ना, and if there are certain policies to be implemented implemented under the Disaster Management Act 2005, it will ensure that the things are being implemented, and it will try to recommend certain things to get it implemented. ठीक है ना, the basic purpose is to what? To review the progress in the field of disaster management, Now the main body is your National Disaster Management Authority. Up to here things are clear? Any doubt hai? Up to here things have been cleared? Mridul, Deepak ji, Sonam ji, please do let me know. यहाँ तक चीजें clear है? If any doubt, please do let me know. Just a moment. Okay, it's clear yet, sir? Okay, no doubt. Okay, so now we have to study regarding the main body, National Disaster Management Authority. National Disaster Management Authority. You have seen that the National Disaster Management Authority has been created under the Disaster Management Act 2005. Even the Disaster Management Act 2005, it creates State Disaster Management Authority and District Disaster Management Authority. Now we have to see what is its function. ठीक है ना? So the National Disaster Management Authority is the apex body for the disaster management. Remember, National Disaster Management Body is the topmost body, is the apex body for disaster management, which has the responsibility of laying down the policies, plans, guidelines for disaster management. ठीक है ना, अभी तक हम लोगों ने देखा था, they are basically National Executive Committee जो है, and National Executive Committee, it is basically responsible for coordinating with the different departments, and we have seen that the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, it is basically responsible for reviewing the progress, है ना. अगर आप यहाँ देख रहे हैं, we have seen that, ठीक है, हमें चीजों को कोरिलेट करना है, ठीक है ना. National Executive, when you talk about the National Executive Committee, remember when you talk about National Executive Committee, National Executive Committee, ठीक है ना, so it is basically responsible for coordinating, responsible for coordinating with different departments, है ना, coordinating with different departments. Okay, and on the other hand, if you see National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, it is basically responsible for reviewing the progress of disaster management or recommending certain ideas for disaster management. ठीक है ना, so we talk about National Platform for Disaster Management, National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, for disaster risk reduction. Okay, ये क्या आंसर करता है? It reviews the progress in disaster management. This is how to prepare the short notes. ठीक है ना? It reviews and recommends disaster risk reduction. It reviews and recommends disaster management policies. ठीक है, तो these are the two bodies. Now we have to study regarding the National Disaster Management Authority. So you can see that when you talk about the National Disaster Management Authority, it is an apex body. Apex body means it is the top body in the field of disaster management, which is having the responsibility for laying down the policies, plans and guidelines. The policies, plans and guidelines are being laid down by National Disaster Management Authority. ठीक है? The guidelines of National Disaster Management Authority assist central ministries, departments and states to formulate their respective disaster management plans. So you can see that National Disaster Management Authority, it is basically responsible for laying down the policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management. And it is these guidelines which are being implemented by central ministry, departments and the states to formulate their respective disaster management plans. ठीक है ना? ऐसे स्टेट अपने से फॉर्मुलेट नहीं कर सकता है. स्टेट जो है, जो आपके गाइडलाइंस प्रोवाइड किए गए हैं, किसके द्वारा? जो गाइडलाइंस प्रोवाइड किए गए हैं आपका नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी के द्वारा, उसी को जो है ब्लूप्रिंट को समझ के वहां पे उस स्टेट के बारे, स्टेट के ज्योग्राफिकल पोजीशन देखा जाएगा, उसकी वल्नरेबिलिटी देखी जाएगी, उसके अनुसार जो है उसको ब्लूप्रिंट के तौर पे यूटिलाइज किया जा सकता है स्टेट के थ्रू. ठीक है. नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी has the mandate to deal with all type of disaster, natural and man-made, human induced. ठीक है ना? अब हम लोग देखेंगे what is the basic functions. The basic functions already we have discussed. It is basically responsible for laying down the policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management. ठीक है ना? अब हम लोग देखेंगे इसकी main functions को. We have to study the different functions of National Disaster Management Authority. So first of all, it approves the National Disaster Management plans and plans of central ministries. ठीक है ना? It approves the National Disaster Management plan. It approves National Disaster Management plan. National Disaster Management. Just a moment. Okay, sorry. So now we are going to study regarding the what is the function of National Disaster Management Authority. National Disaster Management Authority. So you can see that it approves National Disaster Management plan, National Disaster Management plans, and plans for the central ministries and departments. ठीक है ना, ठीक है ना, it is basically responsible for approving national disaster management plan and the plans of the central ministry and department. The general superintendence, direction, control of national disaster response force are vested in the exercise by the national disaster management authority. So you have seen that we are having national disaster, you have seen that we are having NDRF टीम के बारे में आपने न्यूज़पेपर में देखा होगा. We are having NDRF, National Disaster Response Force. These forces are basically responsible for the purpose. These forces are basically responsible for to look after during the time of disaster for the purpose of search, rescue operation. These teams are responsible. So the general superintendent's directions and the control of this team, control of this National Disaster Response Force, lies with the National Disaster Management Authority. Lies with the National Disaster Management Authority. Even we are having National Institute of Disaster Management works within the framework of broad policies and guidelines and laid down by the National Disaster Management Authority. So we have seen that we are having National Institute of Disaster Management. We will study regarding the National Institute of Disaster Management. Just you have to know that National Institute of Disaster Management is a school for the purpose of skill development, for the purpose of training, and for the purpose of ensuring that the trained skilled persons or नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पॉन्स फोर्स जो है, इसका पर्पस क्या होता है? व्हेन यू टॉक अबाउट द नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट, इट बेसिक पर्पस इज टू provide the training to national disaster response force. Even the community participation जो होता है ना, even the community participations are, communities are being trained by National Institute of Disaster Management so that they can participate during the time of disasters, है ना, and minimize the risk. तो ये भी अगर हम बात करेंगे द नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट की भी अगर हम बात करेंगे, इट ब्रॉड पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस आर बीइंग डिजाइन्ड बाय National Disaster Management Authority. National Disaster Management Authority has the power to authorize the department or authorities to make emergency procurement of materials for rescue and relief in a threatening disaster situation. इतना ठीक है ना? So you can see that National Disaster Management Authority, it is also basically responsible for the purpose to authorize certain departments to procure certain items, to procure foods or procure medicines so that the disasters can be easily handled. It takes some other measures as it may consider necessary for the prevention of disasters, mitigations, preparedness, and capacity building for dealing with the threatening of disaster situations. You can see that basically National Disaster Management Authority जो है, it is also responsible that we have seen that in a disaster management cycle we are having three parts. One is your pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster. So basically National Disaster Management Authority, it is more oriented to the pre-disaster stuff. Pre-disaster means how disaster can be prevented. ठीक है ना, disaster can be, what are the mitigation strategies, how we are prepared to deal with the particular disaster, how the particular area is vulnerable to what type of disaster, ठीक है ना. So and how to build the capacity of that particular disease. All these things are being dealt by National Disaster Management Authority. It oversees the provisions and applications of fund for mitigations, preparedness, and it is also responsible for to look after the provision and application of fund for the purpose of mitigation and preparational measures. ठीक है, थोड़ा सा सेशन बोरिंग है, कोई बात नहीं, because we are studying the act. But for tomorrow onward, the session will be interesting because we will take different type of hazards, chemical hazards, physical hazards, landslides, floods. All these things will be taken, and we will try to make the session as interesting as we can. Are you finding the session interesting or boring? Mritul ji, Deepak ji, Sonam ji, बताइए. Are you finding the session bit interactive one or a bit boring one? जल्दी से बताएं आप लोग. कमेंट करके जल्दी से बताइए, सेशन इंटरेस्टिंग लग रहा है कि आप लोगों को बोरिंग लग रहा है? डोंट वरी, ये पीडीएफ जो है, आई विल सबमिट दिस पीडीएफ बाय टुडे इटसेल्फ एट 11:30 PM on the Drona Foundation group so that you can study it once. Otherwise, if the PDF will be submitted after 2 days, the things will elapse from your mind, or things will evaporate from your mind. बताइए जल्दी जल्दी. Yes sir. Yes sir means what? Are you guys finding it interesting or a bit boring one? Interesting or bit boring one? Yes sir means what? Sir, मेरे को तो इंटरेस्टिंग लग रहा है क्योंकि इसमें स्कीम्स है गवर्नमेंट की. ओके, थैंक यू मृदुल जी. नॉट स्कीम्स, that we are learning toward the disaster management. ये आपको भी पता होना चाहिए. और being an UPSC aspirant, you should also know what is disaster management and what is the policies. ठीक है, because during the time of disasters you can also participate in the management of disaster as a volunteer. And you know one thing, देश से बढ़कर कुछ नहीं. If you are getting the opportunity to help those who are stranded in the disaster, it's मतलब यही आपके अंदर एक attribute होना चाहिए to become a UPSC aspirant. चीजों को देखने का अलग अलग नजरिया होता है. ठीक है, तो डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है. दैट्स व्हाई जनरली इट्स अ मेंस टॉपिक एंड यू माइट बी नोइंग दैट यूट्यूब में जो है, यूट्यूब में ये चीजें सारी टॉपिक कवर नहीं की जाती है, बिकॉज सपोज फॉर ऑल द थिंग्स आर कवर्ड इन द यूट्यूब इट इज वेरी डिफिकल्ट, यू माइट बी नोइंग. ठीक है ना, बट मैंने खुद से स्टार्ट इनिशिएटिव लिया है ताकि एटलीस्ट आपका मेंस का सिलेबस कंप्लीट हो जाए. एंड अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट यू गाइस मस्ट नो हाउ टू मैनेज द डिजास्टर. ठीक है, चलिए. So, other emergencies such as terrorism, counterinsurgency, law and other situations, hijacking, air accidents, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapon system, which require the close involvement of security forces or intelligence agencies, and other incidents such as mine disaster, port, harbor emergencies, forest fire, oil fires and oil spills are handled by National Crisis Management Committee. All these things are handled by National Crisis Management Committee. Now we have to see, so we have a study regarding the National Disaster Management Authority. Now it's another body regarding it. It's called National Disaster Management Authority Advisory Committee. ठीक है, National Disaster Management Authority Advisory Committee. ठीक है. So what is National Disaster Management Act Advisory Committee? So it basically comprises of 15 members. If you can see, it basically comprises of 15 members from different departments, so that a brainstorming can be carried out and a proper guidelines can be developed. ठीक है ना? So National Disaster Management Advisory Committee, the 15-member advisory committee under National Disaster Management Act consists of experts from various areas of disaster management and allied discipline, and has representative from academics, government, non-government organizations and a civil society members. So you can see that it's an advisory body. Advisory means it can put down the guidelines, it can provide the recommendations. So it consists of 15-member experts, and the 15-member experts are from the different departments of the government, even from the academics, government, non-government bodies, civil society, so that in a group they can discuss regarding certain disaster, they can do the brainstorming, and they can put down certain recommendations for the purpose of reducing the risk of disaster. Now we will see, we have seen that disaster management. So we have seen that National Disaster Management Authority, it is also looking towards the National Institute of Disaster Management. National Disaster Management Authority जो है, it is also looking after the different policies and strategies of National Institute of Disaster Management. So we will see what is National Institute of Disaster Management and what is its functions, and what is the role played by National Institute of Disaster Management in handling disaster. So the National Institute of Disaster Management is the nodal agency responsible for human resources development. See, human resources development is what? So National Institute जो it is basically responsible for the purpose of training, for the purpose of inculcating the skill regarding how to manage that disaster. So this is what? This is your human resources development. Human resources development, capacity building, training, research, documentation, policy advocacy in the field of disaster management. These are the functions of National Institute of Disaster Management. The National Institute of Disaster Management has built a strategic partnership with various ministries and departments of the central, state and local government, academic, research, technical organization in India, abroad, and other bilateral and multilateral international agencies. So you can see that this particular National Institute of Disaster Management, it has built a strategic partner with the central government, state government, local bodies, even with certain academics, ठीक है ना, even with certain academics outside, so that a collaborative effort can be done, ठीक है ना, a collaborative effort can be done so that they can collaboratively decide certain guidelines that what are the things to be carried on before disaster, what are the things to be carried on after disaster, and what are the things to be carried on post disaster. सारी चीजों को ब्रेनस्टॉर्मिंग किया जा सकता है. It provides technical support to the state government through disaster management centers in the administrative training institutes of the state and union territories. Presently, it is supporting as many 30 such centers. You can see that presently जो है, it is supporting disaster management center जो है, it is supporting on 30 such centers. 6 of them are being developed by Center of Excellence in the specialized area of risk management, flood, earthquake, cyclone, drought, लैंडस्लाइड, इंडस्ट्रियल डिजास्टर्स. तो आपके जो हम अगर हम बात करेंगे, यहाँ पे आपने देखा है लास्ट का जो सेंटेंस है यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ है, इट प्रोवाइड सपोर्ट टू द स्टेट गवर्नमेंट थ्रू डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट सेंटर्स इन द एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूट. तो एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूट की बात करेंगे तो हमारे पास 30 ऐसे इंस्टीट्यूट है, जिसमें से अगर हम बात करेंगे तो सम ऑफ द इंस्टीट्यूट्स आर पर्टिकुलरली designed for how to handle the flood, how to handle earthquake, how to handle cyclone, how to handle drought, landslide and industrial disasters. ठीक है ना. अब हम देखेंगे नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स के बारे में कि जब डिजास्टर ड्यूरिंग द टाइम ऑफ डिजास्टर्स हाउ द रेस्क्यू ऑपरेशंस आर बीइंग ऑपरेटेड, ठीक है ना, हाउ द सर्च ऑपरेशंस आर बीइंग कैरिड आउट, एंड ऑल दिस थिंग्स आर बीइंग कैरिड आउट विद द हेल्प ऑफ नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. सो नाउ वी विल सी व्हाट इज नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स, ठीक है ना, एंड we'll also see what is its objective, इसका functions और objectives क्या होता है, सारी चीजों को हम जो है डिस्कशन करेंगे. Is it clear? Up to here it is clear. Any doubt you can ask me. Any doubt and you can ask me. बताइए. Up to here, if there is any doubt, please do let me know. अब डाउट है तो पूछिए, घबराने की जरूरत नहीं है. अदरवाइज वी विल स्टार्ट नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. चलिए, सो नाउ विल स्टडी रिगार्डिंग नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. क्या होते हैं, व्हाट इज नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट वी विल सी हाउ इट functions, what are its objectives. So you can see that national disaster response force is a specialist response force that can be deployed in threatening disaster situations. So this is when you talk about the border management, and when we talk about the border management, ठीक है ना, we are having BSF. When you talk about the border management, we are having BSF, border security forces, just like that, for the purpose of managing the disaster, for the purpose of how the disasters are being managed during the time of disasters, ठीक है ना, how to do the rescue operation during the time of disasters, how the means if somebody is being stranded, how to rescue him. Apart from that, we have to do the search operations. ठीक, किसके द्वारा किया जाता है, ये किया जाता है आपका किसके द्वारा, एनडीआरएफ के थ्रू. जिस तरीके से बॉर्डर को बॉर्डर सिक्योरिटी फोर्सेस मैनेजमेंट करते हैं बॉर्डर्स, उसी तरीका से जो है जब वी टॉक अबाउट द डिजास्टर, इट इज बीइंग डिजास्टर जो है, डिजास्टर्स की जो प्रॉब्लम जो है, ठीक है, ड्यूरिंग द टाइम ऑफ डिजास्टर, इट इज बीइंग टेकन केयर ऑफ नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. The general superintendence, direction and control of this force is vested in exercise by the National Disaster Management Authority, and the command and supervision of the force vested in the Director General of National Disaster Response Force. So you can see that अगर हम बात करेंगे when we talk about the National Disaster Response Force, तो जो आपको पता ही है कि National Disaster Response Force जो होता है, द नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स की अगर हम बात करेंगे तो सुपरिटेंडेंस, डायरेक्शन एंड कंट्रोल उसको किसके द्वारा मॉनिटर किया जाता है, ऑल दिस थिंग इज मॉनिटर्ड बाय नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना. एंड द कमांड मींस कमांड इन द सेंस व्हेन टू एक्ट, हाउ टू एक्ट आर बीइंग गिवन बाय डायरेक्टर जनरल ऑफ नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स, ठीक है ना. तो कंप्लीट अगर हम बात करेंगे, कंप्लीट अगर बात करेंगे नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट, लिसन टू मी, ठीक है ना, देखिए मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, होम अफेयर्स, इसके नीचे आएगा डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट डिवीजन, डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट डिवीजन, इसके अंदर आएगा नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, और इसके अंदर आएगा नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स, इसके अंदर आएगा आपका नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स, नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स। और जो नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स जो है, ठीक है ना, इट इज बीइंग कंट्रोल्ड बाय नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, बट द कमांड इज बीइंग गिवन बाय डायरेक्टर जनरल ऑफ, बट द कमांड and control, command and control is being done by Director General of National Disaster Response Force. It's been done by Director General of नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स। ठीक है, इज इट ओके? बताइए। इज इट ओके? चलिए, ठीक है। At present, National Disaster Response Force consists of 12 battalions. You do not have to remember it, ठीक है ना? You do not have to remember it. Just what you have to remember that National Disaster Response Force जो है, it is being controlled and supervised by National Disaster Management Authority, but the command is being given by Director General of National Disaster Response Force. So, just जानकारी के at present the National Disaster Response Force consists of 12 battalions, 3 each of BSF, CRPF and 2 each from CISF, ITBF and SSB. ठीक है। At present, each battalion consists of 1149 personnel. ठीक है ना, एक बटालियन की बात करेंगे, हमारे पास कितना 12 बटालियन है, और एक बटालियन की अगर हम बात करेंगे तो एक बटालियन में आपको 1149 पर्सनल है। The proactive availability of these forces to the states and its pre-positioning in threatening disaster situation has immensely helped minimize damage caused due to the calamities in the country. So आप देख सकते हैं कि हमारे पास जो है, when we talk about, हमारे पास कुल मिला के जो है 12 बटालियंस है, 12, एंड एक बटालियंस में पे कितने लोग पाए जाते हैं? 1149 पर्सनल पाए जाते हैं। ठीक है, चलिए एग्जाम्पल की बात करेंगे। व्हाट इज द रोल, just case studies we have to see what is the role that is being played by National Disaster Response Force। तो आप देख सकते हैं, you can see that the first major test of disaster for NDRF, National Disaster Response Force, was Kosi flood in 2008। ठीक है ना, you know that the National Disaster Response Force are being created under the Disaster Management Act 2005। 2005 में जो है नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स वाज बीइंग क्रिएटेड। उनकी पहली टेस्टिंग की अगर बात करें तो पहली टेस्टिंग आपको कोसी फ्लड जो बिहार में जो है 2008 में टेस्टिंग किया गया था। अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट द सिचुएशन वाज हैंडल्ड बाय एनडीआरएफ ऑन द वार फुटिंग बाय सेंडिंग फ्लड रेस्क्यू ट्रेन टू द 5 फ्लड अफेक्टेड डिस्ट्रिक्ट विद एटमोस्ट promptitude। as a result 1 लाख affected people were rescued। कितने? 1 लाख affected people जो है they were been rescued। कब? कोसी फ्लड के टाइम पे। The prompt and timely response of NDRF, National Disaster Response Force, was appreciated by then the Chief Minister of Bihar। Again अगर देखेंगे तो 2015 की बात करेंगे, we'll talk about the 2015। In the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, magnitude 7.8, India National Disaster Response Force made the headline by capitalizing the golden hours rule of disaster management by being the first on the ground। So what does it mean? 2015 की बात करेंगे तो 2015 में नेपाल वाज बीइंग हिट बाय अर्थक्वेक एंड at a magnitude of around 7.8, and you must know that it was the national disaster response force, it was India's national disaster response force that was the first to land over there for the purpose of rescue. सबसे पहले उन लोग पहुंचे थे, ठीक है ना. In the rescue operation, the personnel of national disaster response force pulled out 11 live victims out of total figure of 16. ठीक है. The national disaster response force has also acquired considerable expertise in facing chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear challenges. The creditable task of NDRF in retrieving cobalt-60 radiological material at Mayapuri, Delhi during April and May 2010 has been an acid test of NDRF. तो आप देख सकते हैं कोबाल्ट 60 रेडिएशन से काम जो हुआ था जब दिल्ली में, उसमें भी इन लोगों ने काफी अच्छा तरीका से रेस्क्यू ऑपरेशन परफॉर्म किया है. ठीक है. So this is the chart that I have developed. This is the chart that we have developed. Whatever we have studied in the chart, ठीक है ना, ये चार्ट आप लोगों के लिए है. I will submit it into your, ठीक है ना, एक पीपीटी बना के मैं सबमिट कर देता हूँ. अब हम देखेंगे इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क एट स्टेट लेवल. सो वी हैव डील्ड विद द इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क एट नेशनल लेवल. हम स्टेट लेवल की बात करेंगे, ठीक है ना. लेट मी हैव सम वाटर, प्लीज वेट, डोंट गो एनीवेयर, जस्ट गिव मी 2 minutes. मेरी नहीं बता, जब किसी ने देखा ठीक है. Okay, चलिए. Now we will see institutional framework at state level. So we have seen the institutional framework at national level. ठीक है ना. नेशनल में हमने देखा था, सारी चीजों की स्टडी की है, सारी चीजें स्टडी किया है. अब हम देखेंगे द सेम थिंग एट स्टेट लेवल. ठीक है ना. तो आपने देखा था द पॉलिसीज गाइडलाइन जो होता है, द पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस आर बीइंग प्रिपेयर्ड बाय नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड इट इज अप टू द स्टेट टू इम्प्लीमेंट दोस. एंड स्टेट जो है कुछ इसमें चेंजेस लेके आ सकते हैं, बिकॉज हर एक स्टेट का जियोग्राफिकल पोजीशंस अलग होता है, ठीक है ना, एंड उसकी वल्नरेबिलिटी टुवर्ड्स ईच एंड एवरी डिजास्टर इज डिफरेंट, बट द गाइडलाइंस आर बीइंग प्रोवाइडेड बाय नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी. सो नाउ हियर वी विल सी अबाउट इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क एट स्टेट लेवल. इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क एट स्टेट लेवल. ठीक है. सो as per the DM Act, as per the Disaster Management Act of 2005, each state in India shall have its own institutional framework for disaster management and shall prepare its own disaster management plan. The Disaster Management Act mandates that each state government shall take necessary steps for integration of measures for prevention of disaster or mitigation into a state development plan, allocation of funds, and establish early warning systems. So now we have seen that it is the responsibility of the state that each state should come out with its own disaster management plan, ठीक है ना, for the purpose of reducing the risk of disaster. That means the state is responsible for all the three things: disaster management cycle, pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster. ठीक है ना. Apart from that, they are also responsible for the fund also. अब हम लोग एक एक चीज को यहाँ पे ध्यान से देखेंगे. सबसे पहला जो है, देखिए, depending upon specific situations and needs, the state government shall also assist the central government and central agencies in various aspects of disaster management. So disasters कहाँ होंगे? किसी स्टेट में ही होंगे, किसी स्टेट में ही होंगे, ठीक है ना. इसलिए यहाँ लिखा हुआ है डिपेंडिंग अपॉन द स्पेसिफिक सिचुएशन एंड नीड्स. जिस स्टेट में डिजास्टर हो रहे हैं तो स्टेट गवर्नमेंट जो सबसे पहले रिस्पॉन्ड करते हैं, ठीक है ना. So the state government shall also assist the central government and central agencies in various aspects of disaster management. The Disaster Management Act 2005 mandates the setting of a state disaster management authority with the chief minister at the ex officio chairman. ये काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है, ठीक है ना। तो ये याद रखिएगा, आपने देखा था जब हम बात कर रहे हैं वी आर हैविंग नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। सो अगर हम इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क स्टेट लेवल की बात करेंगे, वी आर हैविंग स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड चीफ मिनिस्टर इज द एक्स ऑफिशियल चेयरमैन ऑफ स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना। द स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड चीफ मिनिस्टर इज द एक्स ऑफिशियल चेयरमैन ऑफ योर स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। सिमिलर सिस्टम विल फंक्शन इन ईच यूनियन टेरिटरी। यूनियन टेरिटरी में क्या होगा, लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर इज द चेयरमैन, लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर इज द चेयरपर्सन, ठीक है ना। तो रिमेंबर दिस थिंग कि स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट एक्ट में जो बात करेंगे तो चीफ मिनिस्टर इज द एक्स ऑफिशियो चेयरमैन, बट अगर हम बात करेंगे यूनियन टेरिटरी में तो लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर जो है दे आर द चेयरपर्सन। तो सबसे पहला जो है स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। व्हाट इज स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट व्हाट इज इट फंक्शन, व्हाट इज इट फंक्शन। As per the Disaster Management Act, as per Disaster Management Act, each state government shall establish the state disaster management authority with the chief minister as the chairperson. So you have seen that already. It is being mentioned in the already we have seen that it is being mentioned in the Disaster Management Act 2005 that there should be institutional legal, है ना, and in the institutional system it is being clearly mentioned that at the central level we should have national disaster management authority, at the state level we should have a state disaster management authority, and at the district level we should have district level disaster authority, and even at the local panchayati level we are having something. So when you talk about the state disaster management authority, ठीक है, state disaster management authority is being there as per the Disaster Management Act, and chief minister जो है is the chairperson of it. In case of union territory you have seen that lieutenant governor is the lieutenant governor is the chairperson, and for the union territory of Delhi की बात करेंगे, for the union territory of Delhi the lieutenant governor and the chief minister shall be the chairperson and vice chairperson, ठीक है ना। तो lieutenant governor जो है it is the chairperson and chief minister जो है it is the vice chairperson of the state disaster management authority. अगर roles and responsibilities की बात करेंगे तो roles and responsibilities are same what we have studied in the national disaster management authority. तो national disaster management authority का जो roles and responsibilities की हमने बात की थी, the same as there in the state disaster management authority, you can see it. So what was the purpose of national disaster management authority? To lay down the important guidelines, policies है कि नहीं, that should be implemented by the state itself. So you can see that the functions of state, the responsibilities of a state disaster management authority includes it lays down policies and plans for disaster management in the state, ठीक है ना, lays down policies and plans for disaster management act, but here the policies and याद रखना but the policies and planned so designed should be in accordance with the national disaster management authority, with the national disaster management authority, ठीक है ना, management authority. So the policies and plans that are being designed by the state disaster management authority, all such things should be in accordance with the policies and guidelines that are being framed by the national disaster management authority. It approves a state disaster management plan. It approves a state disaster management plan in accordance with the guidelines laid by the national disaster management authority. It coordinates the implementation of a state disaster management plan and recommends provision of funds for mitigation and preparedness. So it is also responsible for recommending how much fund is being required if some disaster happen in a particular state. It reviews the developmental plans of the different departments of the state to ensure the integration of prevention, preparedness and mitigation measures. So you can see that all the plans, policies are being framed in accordance with the National Disaster Management Authority. Apart from that, it also state disaster Management Authority, it is also responsible for reviewing the developmental plans, and strategies that are being prepared by the different departments for the purpose of ensuring the integration between prevention, preparedness and recovery, है ना? Prevention, preparedness and mitigation means what are the developmental strategies, what are the developmental plans that are being developed by the different departments so that we can prevent the disaster, so that we can reduce the risk of disaster, and it can be done if the things are planned for the pre-disaster things, pre-disaster. ठीक है, चलिए ओके. Now again we have to see about state executive committee. हमने देखा था, we have seen national executive committee. So what were the function of national executive committee? The function of the national executive committee was to coordinate with the different departments, ठीक है ना, to reduce the risk of disaster. So here also you can see that the state government constitute a state executive committee. The state government constitute a state executive committee headed by the chief secretary to assist the state disaster management authority in the performance of its function. The state executive committee, simple, the national executive function was to coordinate with the different departments. The same, the state executive committee will coordinate and monitor the implementation of national policy, national plan and state plan for disaster management. It will also provide information to the National Disaster Management Authority relating to the different aspects of disaster management. ठीक है ना? So basically, state disaster, आप देख सकते हैं, first of all, at the top level we are having National Disaster Management Authority. Again, at the bottom level we are having State Disaster Management Authority, and again at the bottom level we are having District Disaster Management Authority. So State Disaster Response, the State Disaster Management Authority है, it can also provide certain information to the National Disaster Management Authority. ठीक है ना? So ये चार्ट है. This chart is visible. Please do let me know. This chart is visible. ठीक है, तो देखिए, दिस इज द चार्ट. आप देख सकते हैं यहाँ पे स्टेट लेवल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट कोऑर्डिनेशन मैकेनिज्म मींस इफ समथिंग हैपेंस इन द स्टेट, how the things are being taken care of, so what is the process of coordinating, how the things are being coordinated. तो आप देख सकते हैं यहाँ पे जो है सबसे पहले क्या है आपका, सबसे पहले देख सकते हैं we are having नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी. नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी, आपने कहा था कि नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी इट इज बेसिकली रिस्पांसिबल फॉर लेइंग डाउन द पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस दैट हैव्स टू बी कॉपीड बाय द स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी, है ना. तो वही आपने देखा यहाँ पे कि नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी, ठीक है, तो नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी जो है एक इसको स्टेट गवर्नमेंट को फीडबैक देता है, एंड सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट मिनिस्ट्री आपको स्टेट गवर्नमेंट को फीडबैक देता है. स्टेट गवर्नमेंट की बात करेंगे तो स्टेट गवर्नमेंट में क्या है, फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ मैनेजिंग द डिजास्टर स्टेट डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स. और आप देख सकते हैं कि नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी जो है वो किसमें जाता है आपका, फिर आपका स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी को मॉनिटर करता है. स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी जो है ये आपका फिर नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमिटी फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ कोऑर्डिनेशन कोऑर्डिनेट करता है. नेशनल एग्जीक्यूटिव कमिटी जो है वो इसके साथ भी तो कोऑर्डिनेट करता है, डिफरेंट डिपार्टमेंट के साथ तो कोऑर्डिनेट करता है. उसके बाद स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी जो है इसका फंक्शन क्या आपका जाता है, रिलीफ कमिश्नर्स, नोडल ऑफिसर्स दैट वेर रिस्पांसिबल फॉर योर डिस्ट्रीब्यूटिंग मेडिसिन, फूड पैकेज एक्सेट्रा. और उसके रिलीफ कमिश्नर जो है स्टेट इमरजेंसी ऑपरेशन सेंटर. और फिर यहाँ से अगर आप देखेंगे तो रिलीफ कमिश्नर जो है ये आपका स्टेट डिपार्टमेंट लाइन एजेंसी विद डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट रेस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज. और फिर आपके स्टेट डिजास्टर फिर किसको फीडबैक देता है, आपका डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी. ठीक है, चलिए अब थोड़ा सा हम लोग देखते हैं डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऑथोरिटी को. अब हम लोग देखेंगे कि डिस्ट्रिक्ट लेवल पे, स्टेट लेवल पे हम लोगों ने इंस्टीट्यूशनल मैकेनिज्म्स को देख लिया. नाउ वी हैव टू स्टडी द इंस्टीट्यूशनल मैकेनिज्म एट द डिस्ट्रिक्ट लेवल. ठीक है, डिस्ट्रिक्ट लेवल. सो नाउ हम लोग को देखना है व्हाट इज द फंक्शन ऑफ डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। आपने देखा नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी टू ले डाउन द पॉलिसीज एंड फ्रेमवर्क। फिर हमने देखा स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, इट इज आल्सो रिस्पांसिबल फॉर मैनेजिंग फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ लेइंग डाउन पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस, बट दोस पॉलिसी एंड गाइडलाइंस जो होगा it should be framed in accordance with the national disaster management authority. तो सेम वी आर हैविंग डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना। सो लेकिन याद रखिएगा जब हम बात करते हैं, जब हमने बात किया था आपका स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी का, सो वहां पे चीफ मिनिस्टर जो है इट इज एक्टिंग एज चेयरमैन, एंड इन द केस ऑफ यूनियन टेरिटरी लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर जो इट इज एक्टिंग एज चेयरमैन, एंड इन द केस ऑफ दिल्ली जो है लेफ्टिनेंट गवर्नर जो है चेयरमैन है और चीफ मिनिस्टर जो है आपका वाइस चेयरमैन है। तो ये आपका काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि आंसर जब लिखते हैं यू हैव टू कोट इट। सो व्हेन यू टॉक अबाउट द डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, याद रखिएगा डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर इज द, इट इज हेडेड बाय डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर, इट इज हेडेड बाय डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर। तो चेयरमैन कौन होगा इसका? डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर। ये काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है, ठीक है। Is it okay? So at the district level, district disaster management authority headed by the district collector and district magistrate is responsible for overall coordination of the disaster management efforts and planning. So you have seen that at the district level, if you think of district disaster management authority is there, and it is being headed by the district magistrate or district collector, and it is also responsible for coordinating the different disaster management efforts. As per the provision of the act, each state government establishes a district disaster management authority for every district in the state. So it is, there is a provision, याद रखिएगा, it is not mandatory, it is not mandatory, but there is a provision in the disaster management act 2005 that every state government should establish district disaster management authority for each and every district in the state. That and the district disaster management authority is being headed by the district collector. The state government appoints a officer not below the rank of additional collector, additional district magistrate of the district to be chief executive officer of the district disaster management authority. So district disaster management authority की अगर हम बात करेंगे, डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी की अगर हम बात करेंगे तो इट इज बीइंग हेडेड बाय द डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर, एंड अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट स्टेट गवर्नमेंट अपॉइंट्स एन ऑफिसर नॉट बिलो द रैंक ऑफ एडिशनल कलेक्टर, एडिशनल डिस्ट्रिक्ट मजिस्ट्रेट टू एक्ट एज ए सीईओ, चीफ एग्जीक्यूटिव ऑफिसर्स ऑफ ए डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना, क्योंकि डिजास्टर्स कहीं भी आएंगे डिस्ट्रिक्ट में ही आते हैं। तो दैट इज हैविंग ए सीईओ फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ मॉनिटरिंग ऑफ द डिजास्टर। आपने कुछ लिखा था मृदुल, यू हैव deleted it, what was that? Any doubt? Then you can ask me. Any doubt? चलिए, so the district disaster management authority prepares the district management plan for the district and monitor its implementation. But you must remember that the guidelines, the district disaster management, suppose this is your district disaster management authority, ठीक है ना, district disaster management authority, management authority, ठीक है, authority. So remember one thing, it is being headed by chairperson की अगर हम बात करेंगे, chairperson या headed by ये होगा आपका डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर, okay. And apart from that, the CEO, when you talk about the CEO means chief executive officer, CEO, chief executive officer. तो chief executive officers कौन रहेगा? It is being appointed by the state, not below the rank of your additional district magistrate. याद रखिएगा, CEO it is appointed by state, CEO appointed by state government, not below the rank of below the not below the rank of not below the rank of your additional district magistrate, additional district magistrate, additional district magistrate, additional district magistrate. But one thing you must know, the purpose of district disaster management authority is to lay down the guidelines and policies for the purpose of managing the disaster. Lay down the policies and, ठीक है ना. So the basic objective क्या है इसका? Objective जो है, the basic objective is to lay down the policies and guidelines for disaster management. To lay down policies and guidelines to reduce the risk of disaster, to reduce the risk of disaster. Okay, but one thing you must know, the policies and guidelines that have been framed by district disaster management authority should be in accordance with the state disaster management authority, which in turn is in accordance with the national disaster management authority. So you can write it over here that the policies and guidelines framed, the policies and guidelines are so framed, the policies and guidelines framed should be in accordance with National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority. ठीक है? This is how we should prepare the notes. Medrul ji, just I have drawn it. This is the way to prepare the notes, so that इस notes को देख के जो है, you can think what is disaster management authority. Deepak, are you there in my class? Deepak, Sonam, are you there in my class? बताइए. This is how we should prepare the notes. ठीक है, चलिए. Now we will see the local panchayat raj institutions, मतलब bottom up approach. ठीक है ना? We will see the local panchayati raj institutions. So you can see that local authorities, panchayati raj institutions, municipalities, district and cantonment boards, town planning authorities, which control and manage civic services, ensure capacity building of their employees for managing disaster, carrying out relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction activities in the affected area. So आप देख सकते हैं कि देखिए, कुछ भी अगर कोई भी डिजास्टर जो होता है, ठीक है, किसी भी डिजास्टर्स की बात करते हैं, तो ड्यूरिंग द टाइम ऑफ डिजास्टर, नो डाउट नेशनल डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स, स्टेट डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फोर्स जो होते हैं, दे आर ऑफ मच इंपॉर्टेंट. बट अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट लोकल अथॉरिटीज जो है, दे आर आल्सो वेरी मच रिस्पांसिबल फॉर building the capacity, for bringing resilience to the system. ठीक है, and they are also responsible for managing disaster, carrying out relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction activities in the affected area. ठीक है. They also prepare the disaster management plan as per the national and state guidelines. ठीक है. Now we will see financial arrangement under NDM Act of 2005. Now how the finances are being arranged. How the finances are being arranged, because without finances you can't provide the relief. Even without finances you can't carry out the pre-disaster things, you can't carry out during the disaster and post-disaster. That means without finance you can't, you cannot manage the disaster management cycle. So what is the purpose of finance, how the finances are being arranged, okay, and who are responsible for such things? So you can see that for that purpose, the Disaster Management Act 2005 clearly mentions about the National Disaster Response Fund. ठीक है ना? National Disaster Response Fund, it has been clearly mentioned in the Disaster Management Act 2005. So financial arrangement under the National Disaster Management Act 2005, we are having National Disaster Response Fund. National Disaster Response Fund, ठीक है ना? It is being mentioned in Disaster Management Act of 2005. Mentioned in Disaster Management Act of 2005. ठीक है? Okay. So it is a fund managed by the central government for meeting the expenses of emergency response, relief, rehabilitation during any threatening disaster situation. In the event of calamity, if the requirement of funds for relief operations are beyond the funds available in the state disaster response fund, अगर मान के चलिए already we having also having a state disaster response fund, so state disaster response fund जो है वो सबसे पहले यूटिलाइज होता है फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट साइकिल, बट दोज स्टेट डिजास्टर रिस्पॉन्स फंड आर नॉट सफिशिएंट इनफ, देन क्या होगा, देन additional central assistance is provided from the National Disaster Response Fund. Are you getting my point? You must know that suppose if a disaster happens in a particular area, ठीक है ना, it is being flooded or earthquake, whatever it is, so first the fund is being released by the state disaster response fund. The first funds are being released from the state disaster response fund, but if the funds are not sufficient to look after the disaster, to bring relief to the disaster, or to carry out the disaster management cycle, all the things that are being required, ठीक है ना, then additional central assistance are being provided from the जो होता है are being provided from the National Disaster Response Fund. Even we are having the National Calamity Contingency Fund. We are having the National Calamity Contingency Fund introduced by the 11th Finance Commission, was merged with the NDRF. ठीक है ना? We have developed National Calamity Contingency Fund, but there was a confusion. So finally जो है, it was being merged with the National Disaster Response Fund. So you can think that the National Disaster Response Fund जो है, it is basically responsible for providing the central assistance during the time of disaster if the state disaster response fund are not sufficient to deal with the disaster. चलिए अब हम देखेंगे स्टेट डिजास्टर रिस्पांस फंड. सो देखिए, all these things are the basic concept. Don't worry, from tomorrow itself we are going to take the imaging sessions. We will take the case study of a particular disaster and how it is being managed. ठीक है? यहाँ तक किसी को कुछ डाउट है तो प्लीज डू लेट मी नो. दीपक, मृदुल जी, you guys are having 1 minute. Please do let me know if there is any doubt. बताइए क्या डाउट है? मृदुल जी प्लीज डू लेट मी नो, बताइए व्हाट इज द डाउट? व्हाट इज द डाउट? स्टेट एंड सेंट्रल से रिलेटेड डाउट है, ऑथोरिटी भी, कोई बात नहीं, मुझे बताइए क्या डाउट है, सो दैट आई कैन एड्रेस योर डाउट। बताएं क्या डाउट है? दीपक कुमार, सोनम, प्लीज डू लेट मी नो व्हाट इज द डाउट। मैं कंप्लीट एक मैसेज कर दीजिए, सो दैट आई कैन एड्रेस योर डाउट। एक मैसेज ड्रॉप कर दीजिए। सर कैन एनी ऑथोरिटी इंटरफेयर इन एनी अदर कंट्री? यस, मैं बताता हूं, ठीक है ना, चलो चलिए ठीक है ना। फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल यू कैन ड्रॉ दिस चार्ट। मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स के अंतर्गत आता है आपका डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट। ध्यान से देखिए, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स हो गया, दिस इज योर मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स, ठीक है ना। एंड when you talk about the ministry of home affairs, we are having disaster management cell, disaster management, ठीक है। अब मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ होम अफेयर्स की बात करेंगे, सो द एपेक्स बॉडी इज योर नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। याद रखिएगा, नेशनल नेशनल ध्यान से देखिए, नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना। एक ही में ड्रॉ करने की कोशिश कर रहा हूं, नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। ये क्या है आपको पता है, ये आपका एपेक्स बॉडी है, दिस इज द टॉप मोस्ट बॉडी, ठीक है ना, दिस इज योर, अब मैं आपको क्वेश्चंस को बता दूंगा, ठीक है ना। दिस इज द एपेक्स बॉडी, ये क्या है आपका, ये आपका एपेक्स बॉडी है, एपेक्स बॉडी, एपेक्स बॉडी, ठीक है ना, टॉप मोस्ट बॉडी। अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट आपको पता है इट फंक्शन इज टू lay down the important policies and guidelines, lay down the important policies and guidelines for disaster management। ध्यान से देखिएगा, to lay down important policies and guidelines, to lay down important policies and guidelines। और ये जो पॉलिसीज एंड जो गाइडलाइन जो है, ठीक है ना, इससे ही आपका क्या बनता है, इससे आपका बनता है, यहाँ इसके नीचे आता है आपका जो स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। यहाँ पे क्या आता है आपका स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है, स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। Okay, now the policies and guidelines that are being framed by national disaster management authority, ठीक है ना, उसी को कॉपी करके आपको स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, सेम टू सेम नहीं होना चाहिए, बिकॉज एवरी स्टेट जो है इट इज वल्नरेबल टुवर्ड्स डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ डिजास्टर्स, ठीक है ना, बट द मोर और लेस कॉमन थिंग्स विल बी इंप्लीमेंटेड। याद रखिएगा, स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी जो होता है इट फ्रेम्स पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस, लेकिन जो पॉलिसी एंड गाइडलाइन जो फ्रेम होते हैं इन अकॉर्डेंस विथ नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी, ठीक है ना। फिर इसके नीचे कौन आता है, इसके नीचे आता है आपका डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी। इसके नीचे कौन आता है, डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी आता है आपका, डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट authority. Again it function is to frame policies and guidelines in accordance with the frame policies and guidelines in accordance with National Disaster Management Authority and State Disaster Management Authority. Now what is the interference, how the things are being interfered. District disaster management authority cannot interfere with the state disaster management authority, and it cannot interfere with the national disaster management authority. But if the state disaster management authority, if it framed certain policies and guidelines that is totally against the national disaster management authority policies, then the national disaster management authority can interfere with the state disaster management authority. ठीक है ना? So national disaster management authority can interfere. National disaster management authority can interfere in the policies, guidelines of the state disaster management authority if they are totally against, totally against, ठीक है ना, against. And apart from that, national disaster management authority and state disaster management authority, they can both interfere in the policies framed by district disaster management authority. ठीक है ना? So national disaster management authority plus the state disaster management authority can interfere in district disaster management authority if policies framed by it, is totally against. ठीक है मृदुल, is it okay? Is it okay? ठीक है, देखिए, that's why I'm asking you guys to attend the session on a live note, so that if any doubt persists in your mind, that can be instantaneously cleared. ठीक है? और कुछ डाउट पूछिए, अच्छा लगता है. ओके, दीपक, एनी डाउट? Deepak ji, any doubt? Chale, let us continue. So we are studying regarding the state disaster response fund. So the basic thing what you must know, if there is a disaster, listen, if there is a disaster, this bodies come under the disaster management. Yes, this bodies come under the disaster management. Okay. ठीक है, चलिए. So now we have to discuss regarding a state disaster response fund. So the two things we must remember, that if there is any disaster in the state, ठीक है ना, it is the responsibility of state disaster management authority along with the state disaster response fund. The financial things are being managed by the state disaster response fund, and if those finances are not sufficient, then central assistance are being provided from the national disaster response fund. So याद रखिएगा, first to mitigate the disaster, or during the disaster and post disaster recovery and reconstruction programs are being managed by state disaster response fund. ठीक है, तो याद रखिएगा, mitigation strategies during disaster strategies ठीक है ना, during disaster rescue operation, post disaster की अगर हम बात करेंगे तो recovery and reconstruction, redevelopment and reconstruction stages, recovery, reconstruction, redevelopment. ठीक है ना, इसके लिए जो भी पैसा चाहिए the finances is being provided by the state disaster response fund, but if the finances are not sufficient, then the central assistance is being provided. The central assistance is being provided from the national disaster response fund. This is the basic funda. Now let us go through this. So you can see that the state disaster response fund. A state disaster response fund is used only for meeting the expenditure for providing immediate relief to the victims of the disaster. ठीक है ना? Okay. So state disaster की बात करेंगे तो state disaster जो है it is basically responsible for providing immediate relief to the victims of disaster. ठीक है? The state specific disaster within the local context in the state which are not included in the notified list of disaster are also eligible for assistance from the state disaster response fund. National disaster response fund and state disaster response fund have the provision of gratuitous relief, search, rescue operations, relief measures, airdropping for essential supplies, emergency supplies for drinking water, clearance of affected area, including management of debris, agricultural, animal husbandry, fisheries, handicraft. That means what? When you talk about the state disaster response force, the one of the basic responsibilities of state disaster response fund is to finance the immediate services. Immediate services comes under what? Quick services. Quick services means rescue, search operations, and provide the food and medical emergencies. But also it also state disaster response fund. It is also being utilized for mitigation strategies and post disaster. Post disaster means for the purpose of recovery, reconstruction, and redevelopmental stages. ठीक है ना? चलिए अब now we have to see नेशनल डिजास्टर मिटिगेशन फंड. नेशनल डिजास्टर मिटिगेशन फंड. ठीक है ना? सो द नेशनल डिजास्टर मिटिगेशन फंड हैज नॉट बीन सेट अप. नेशनल, देखिए व्हाट डू यू अंडरस्टैंड बाय मिटिगेशन. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, तो मिटिगेशन मींस सपोज if a particular area is going to get flooded, you are quite aware of it. Now you have to do the preparedness. This is called pre-disaster preparedness. How you can save this particular area from the flooded. If it is flooded also, how you can prevent casualties. Apart from that, how the economic activity is not to be shut down. So what you will do, you will try to regenerate wetlands, you will try to regenerate ponds. ठीक है ना? Apart from that, you will try to construct sanitation activities on the upper part of the area. So all these things जो है, this comes under the mitigation strategy. That means all these things are the preparedness. So particular जो है government ने सोचा to create national disaster mitigation fund, but it was not being set up. It was not being set up because for the mitigation also we are getting the fund from the national disaster response fund and state disaster response fund. So what is the fun of creating lot of institutions? ठीक है? So National Disaster Mitigation Fund has not been set up. The government feels that at present there are sufficient schemes to take care of mitigation measures in different projects, and the need to create a specific or separate National Disaster Mitigation Fund has not been felt. The objective of creation of National Disaster Mitigation Fund is for the project exclusively for the purpose of mitigation, which is being served by the existing. There are a lot of central sector schemes that is basically oriented towards the mitigation strategies, just like as प्रधानमंत्री कृषि सिंचाई योजना, नेशनल मिशन ऑफ सस्टेनेबल एग्रीकल्चर, नमामि गंगे, नेशनल गंगा प्लान, रिवर बेसिन मैनेजमेंट, नेशनल रिवर कंजर्वेशन प्लान, एंड वाटर resources management. These are the government central sector schemes which are responsible for mitigation strategies, because of which जो है national disaster mitigation funds are not being set up. The National Disaster Response Reserve. National Disaster Response Reserve. The 13th Finance Commission recommended for creation of a National Disaster Response Reserve with a corpus of 250 crore to meet the immediate requirement of relief material. ठीक है ना? So the 13th Finance Commission, they have recommended to set up a National Disaster Response Fund with a corpus around 250 crore for the purpose of providing immediate relief during the time of disaster. The purpose of creating National Disaster Response Reserve is to mitigate the suffering of victims of disaster which are beyond the coping capacity of the state. ठीक है ना? Beyond the coping capacity of the state means if the state disaster response fund is not sufficient. If a state disaster response fund, if state disaster response, if a state disaster response fund is not sufficient, response fund is not sufficient. ठीक है? Now we have to see what are the drawbacks of National Disaster Management Act 2005. This is a much important. After that we'll try to wrap up the session. From again tomorrow we will start the new session. ठीक है ना? So now we have to see what are the drawbacks of National Disaster Management Act 2005. So you can see that the first drawback is the implementation of National Disaster Act has been slow and slack. So the first is note that the National Disaster Management Act has provided a lot of policies, a lot of guidelines, but when it comes to the implementation phases, ठीक है ना, it is very slow and slack. It is very slow and slack. ठीक है ना? Just there is an example like there was a 7-year delay from 2006 to 2013 in finalizing the National Plan on Disaster Management. ठीक है ना? So you must know that we are in the tomorrow session we are going to study the National Disaster Management Plan of 2016. So you can see that the Disaster Management Act was created in 2005 itself, but it took around a lot of years for the creation of Disaster Management Plan 2016. So you can see that the process is very slow. Apart from that, the act has been criticized for marginalizing non-governmental organizations, elected local representatives, and local communities and civic groups. So you can see that in the disaster management, in the National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority, District Disaster Management Authority, ठीक है ना? You have seen that there is no participation of local government NGOs. There is no participation of NGOs. Apart from that, the elected representatives, MLA and MPs, are not being included for the purpose of managing the disaster. And apart from that, local communities and civic groups are also not being included. So they are marginalizing this section. ठीक है ना? It has been accused of fostering a hierarchical, bureaucratic, command control, top-down approach. So it talked about the top-down approach. ठीक है ना? That top-down approach means if the policies and guidelines are being framed by the National Disaster Management Authority, it must be copied and implemented by State Disaster Management Authority. So it talked about the top-down approach. It has neglected the bottom-up approach. Generally, what happens? अगर disasters की बात करेंगे, disasters की अगर हम बात करते हैं, तो it is the district which is much more affected, and district की बात करेंगे, they are quite aware what are the resources it is having and what are the vulnerabilities it is having. So यहाँ पे जो है आप देख सकते हैं कि more power should be provided to the bottom level, लेकिन यहाँ पे जो यहाँ पे भी जो है एक आप कह सकते हैं bureaucratic and top up approach जो है top down approach जो है वो follow किया गया है. Apart from that, you can see that the performance audit report of the disaster management mechanism in the country was released by competent auditor general in India. So अगर हम बात करेंगे, so the performance audit of disaster management of 2005, it was being conducted by the competent auditor general, and the report was being released in 2013. A report जो है it has identified a lot of loopholes. It has identified a lot of loopholes. Like one of the reports said that none of the major projects taken up by National Disaster Management Authority was complete. See, ठीक है ना? It is being reviewed by, and the audit was being carried up by competent auditor general of India 2013 itself, and it has been clearly mentioned in the report that none of the major project that is being undertaken by the National Disaster Management Authority is completed. You can think of जितने भी जो projects लिए गए, it is not being completed. So it said that none of the major projects taken by NDMA was complete. The project were either abandoned midway or was being redesigned because of initial poor planning. ठीक है ना? That means either they are being abandoned or it is being redesigned of initial poor planning. कहाँ चले गए सारे बच्चे कहाँ थे? Mridul, are you there in the class? Deepak, are you there in the class? The class is not ended yet. The class is not ended yet. सही बच्चे चले गए? चलिए कोई बात नहीं है. Let me end it. As per the CAG report, National Disaster Management Authority has not been performing several functions such as recommending provision of funds for the purpose of mitigation, recommending relief in the repayment of loans. So if you can see that, आप यहाँ पे देख सकते हैं कि आपको पता है कि नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी इज बेसिकली रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर प्रोवाइडिंग द गाइडलाइंस, प्रोवाइडिंग द पॉलिसीज सो दैट इट कैन बी इंप्लीमेंटेड बाय द स्टेट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी एंड सेम टू बी द सेम बाय द डिस्ट्रिक्ट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी. बट सच टाइप ऑफ पॉलिसीज एंड गाइडलाइंस आर नॉट कंटिन्यूसली प्रोवाइडेड बाय द नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी. ठीक है ना. इवन जो है, इवन उसकी बात करेंगे. सो फंड की अगर हम बात करेंगे, फंड की बात करेंगे तो रिकमेंडिंग द प्रोविजन ऑफ फंड इज नॉट बीइंग टेकन केयर ऑफ बाय नेशनल डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटी. It also highlighted that several critical posts of National Disaster Management Authority were vacant. Several critical posts are also vacant and consultant were used for day-to-day working. ठीक है ना. That means आप कह सकते हैं ना क्या उसको contract workers. So several important posts are vacant and you can say that consultant are used for day-to-day working. ठीक है. Even you can see that the public account committee जो है, it is also being utilized for the purpose of reviewing whether it is working properly or not. So public account committee submitted its report on disaster preparedness in India in December 2005. It made the following observation. Under the Act, the National Executive Committee is required to meet at least once in 3 months. So you must know what is National Executive Committee. So we have discussed that the purpose of National Executive Committee is to coordinate with the different departments. ठीक है, to frame the policies है ना. Is to coordinate with the different departments. जैसे मैंने बताया था कि अगर मान के चले कि if there is a disaster, it has to coordinate with the agricultural department कि हम कुछ ऐसे agricultural seeds के इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं जो कि आपका flood resilient हो. ठीक है ना. So that is the purpose of your National Executive Committee. So it was being mentioned in the Disaster Management Act 2005 that the National Executive Committee should meet once in a 3 months. Once in a 3 months they should meet. Because in the National Executive Committee lots of departments जो है उसमें engaged है, so they should meet once in a thrice month. लेकिन क्या, what was the observation? It was found that the committee meet infrequently even when there has been disaster. सोचिए, even there is a disaster, so they should meet for the purpose of discussing with the different departments so that certain things can be evolved. But during the time of disaster, it is being felt during the time of disaster also they didn't meet. Such as example भी यहाँ लिखा हुआ है, such as 2007 flood in West Bengal and the 2008 stampede in Rajasthan. The center, state and the district had not constituted mitigation funds which could be utilized for disaster preparedness and restoration, etc. ठीक है. Various projects undertaken for strengthening the communication network of disaster management were either at the planning stage or were delayed. So you can see that. देखिए कम्युनिकेशन नेटवर्क के लिए बहुत सारे प्रोजेक्ट स्टार्ट करने की बात की गई थी, लेकिन या तो प्रोजेक्ट को खारिज कर दिया गया या प्रोजेक्ट को स्टार्ट ही नहीं किया गया या प्रोजेक्ट को डिले कर दिया गया. तो दिस इज द स्टेटस ऑफ योर डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट एक्ट 2005. द काग रिपोर्ट समरी. नाउ वी विल डिस्कस अबाउट द काग रिपोर्ट. द काग रिपोर्ट समरी सजेस्टेड दैट against a target of installing 219 telemetry station flood forecasting instrument. So the CAG said that it was been mentioned in the Disaster Management Act that around 2019 telemetry station मतलब early warning system of flood forecasting system instrument between 2012 से लेकर 2017 तक, लेकिन कितना स्टेशन इंस्टॉल किया गया? Only 56 has been installed. Only 56 such has been installed as of August 2016. And 59% of the existing telemetry stations were not functional. वो भी जो इसमें से 56 में जो इंस्टॉल किया गया है उसमें भी 59% they are not functional. Just think of it. 27% post of the National Disaster Response Force, 27% post in the National Disaster Response Force were vacant. The NDRF Training Institute, the National Institute of Disaster Response, has not been established, though it has been approved in 2006. So you can see that the National Institute of Disaster Response, ठीक है, National Institute of Disaster Response Institute ही नहीं बन पाया है. So these are the certain drawbacks. ठीक है ना. So अब हम देखेंगे नेशनल पॉलिसी ऑफ डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट 2000 कल स्टडी करेंगे. अगर किसी को कुछ डाउट है तो प्लीज डू लेट मी नो. इफ देयर इज एनी डाउट प्लीज डू लेट मी नो. बताइए. मृदुल जी, Deepak Kumar, Sonam, if there is any doubt, please do let me know. We have completed this. Tomorrow, just we have to go for the National Policy and Disaster Management 2009 and National Disaster Plan 2016. After that, we are going to study the case studies. Any doubt? बताइए. मृदुल, दीपक, बताएं अगर कुछ भी डाउट है तो. I am there to address you. Otherwise, I would like to end the session. जल्दी से बताइए. ठीक है. Okay. So thanks a lot everyone. ठीक है. Thanks a lot everyone.